The hospital chapel was quiet except for the rhythmic beeping of machines in the distance. Soft afternoon light filtered through stained glass windows, casting pale blues and golds across the marble floor. I was sitting alone on a wooden bench, holding my 3-week-old daughter, Emma, against my chest. She was sleeping peacefully, her tiny fingers wrapped around the fabric of my hospital gown. I was exhausted, the kind of exhausted that doesn't have a bottom. I hadn't slept more than 2 hours consecutively since her birth. My body ached from labor and delivery. My mind was foggy from hormonal changes and sleep deprivation. Everything hurt. Everything was overwhelming. But in that moment, holding my daughter in that quiet chapel, I felt something I hadn't felt in days: peace. My name is Caroline Mitchell. I'm 32 years old. I grew up in a military family. My father was a career officer and my mother was a nurse. They taught me about responsibility, sacrifice, and commitment. My father spent months away from home protecting our country. My mother worked 16-hour shifts in emergency rooms. Neither of them complained. They just did what needed to be done because it was the right thing to do. I built my career in the same way. I'm a pediatric surgeon, a specialty I chose specifically because I wanted to help children and families during their most vulnerable moments. I spent 12 years in medical school, residency, and fellowship. 12 years of sacrifice. Missed holidays. Skipped vacations. Long shifts where I'd go 36 hours without sleep. I'd built a reputation as one of the most respected pediatric surgeons in the city. When I met Thomas, I thought I'd finally found someone who understood that kind of commitment. He was successful, a financial advisor with his own practice. He seemed driven, ambitious, kind. He proposed after 8 months of dating. It was romantic and spontaneous, and everything I dreamed of. We married 6 months later. We talked about having children. We talked about building a family. We made plans. We prepared. And then, 3 years into our marriage, I got pregnant. I was thrilled. Terrified, but thrilled. Thomas seemed thrilled too. We went to prenatal classes together. We painted the nursery. We picked out names. We prepared for the arrival of our daughter. But as I got further along in my pregnancy, something shifted with Thomas. He became distant. Detached. He started going out more frequently. He said he needed space. He said he was stressed about becoming a father. He said he needed to spend time with his friends before everything changed. I was 9 months pregnant, exhausted and uncomfortable, and my husband was partying with his friends most weekends. I should have seen the warning signs. But I was too pregnant, too tired, too focused on preparing for motherhood to notice what he was really doing. Emma was born on a Tuesday at 3:47 a.m. I remember Thomas holding her, tears streaming down his face, saying he'd never felt such love. I remember believing that everything was going to be okay. I remember thinking that having Emma would bring us closer together. I was catastrophically wrong. Thomas was wonderful for the first week. He stayed home. He helped with the baby. He brought me meals. He was present and supportive and everything I needed. Then he went back to work. By the second week, he was staying late at the office. By the third week, he was going out with friends after work. By the fourth week, he was coming home drunk at 2 a.m. while I was awake nursing Emma, changing diapers, trying to function on 40 minutes of sleep. I was bleeding. I was in pain. I was dealing with postpartum depression and anxiety. I was struggling to feed my daughter. I was barely holding myself together. And my husband was out partying. I remember one night specifically. It was the night I sat in the chapel holding Emma. It was also the night that everything changed. I'd called Thomas at 8 p.m. Emma was crying inconsolably. I'd fed her. I'd changed her. I'd tried everything to comfort her. I was at my breaking point. I needed my husband. I needed him to come home and help me. I needed him to be present. He told me he was with clients. He said he couldn't leave. He said I needed to handle it. He said I was overreacting. Then he hung up. I sat on the bathroom floor of our house, the house we'd bought together, the house we'd prepared for our daughter, holding my screaming newborn, and I realized something crucial. I was alone. Completely alone. Thomas wasn't going to change. Thomas wasn't going to step up. Thomas wasn't going to be the partner I'd believed he was. The depression that followed was severe. I couldn't sleep even when Emma slept because I was consumed by anxiety. I couldn't eat. I couldn't focus. I couldn't function. My OB/GYN referred me to a therapist, and I started seeing Dr. Patricia Okonkwo twice a week. "He's abandoning you during the most vulnerable time of your life," Dr. Okonkwo said during one of our sessions. That's not okay. That's not something you need to accept. But I felt trapped. I was on maternity leave. I had no income. Thomas controlled the finances. I had nowhere to go. I had no support system because Thomas had isolated me from my friends over the past 2 years, always wanting me to spend time with his friends instead, always making me feel like my friendships were threatening to him. That's when I made the decision. I was going to document everything. I was going to protect myself and my daughter. And I was going to ensure that Thomas faced consequences for his abandonment. I started small. I downloaded our bank statements for the past 6 months. I tracked every expense. I documented every time Thomas came home late or didn't come home at all. I used my phone to photograph receipts from bars, nightclubs, and hotels that showed up on our credit card statements. What I found was devastating but not surprising. Thomas had been spending money on nights out. Hundreds of dollars a week on bars and clubs and restaurants. But more importantly, I found evidence of something else entirely. There was a hotel charge. The Riverside Inn. Multiple times. Multiple rooms. And it wasn't registered to a client meeting or a business event. My husband had been having an affair. I hired a private investigator. I told him I needed documentation of my husband's activities. I needed proof of infidelity. I needed ammunition for a custody battle. The report came back 3 weeks later, and it was worse than I'd imagined. Thomas had been seeing another woman for 6 months. Her name was Brittany. She was 25 years old, 7 years younger than me. She was a bartender at one of his favorite clubs. He'd been paying for her apartment. He'd been taking her on trips. He'd been introducing her to his friends as his close friend. And it had started while I was pregnant. My husband had been having an affair with a younger woman while I was carrying his child. He'd abandoned me during the most vulnerable time of my life to party with his friends and be with his mistress. I felt something cold settle inside me. Not anger. Clarity. I called my attorney immediately. I scheduled a consultation with a divorce lawyer named David Morrison. I brought all of my documentation. The bank statements, the private investigator's report, the receipts, the photographs. "This is comprehensive," David said, reviewing everything. "We have clear evidence of infidelity and, more importantly, evidence of financial irresponsibility during your marriage. Your husband has been spending marital funds on an affair. That's going to be very relevant to asset division and custody determinations." "What about custody?" I asked. "Given that he's been abandoning you and your daughter since her birth, given that he's been engaging in reckless behavior with an affair partner, given that he's been spending marital funds frivolously, we have very strong grounds for primary custody. The court is going to look at his behavior and see a man who's not prioritizing his child's well-being." "I want full custody," I said. "I want to protect my daughter." "We'll pursue it," David said. But I also wanted something else. I wanted Thomas to understand what he'd done. I wanted him to face the consequences not just legally, but personally. I wanted him to feel what I'd felt: abandoned, betrayed, worthless. So I made a decision that would change everything. I filed for divorce, but I didn't tell Thomas immediately. Instead, I prepared. I consulted with my attorney about asset protection. I set up a separate bank account in my name only. I documented my income and my ability to support myself and our daughter. I consulted with my hospital about returning to work earlier than planned. I arranged for childcare for Emma. I also gathered more evidence. I had the private investigator follow Thomas to the Riverside Inn. I had him photograph Thomas entering the hotel with Brittany. I had him document their behavior, kissing in the lobby, hands on each other in the elevator. I recorded phone conversations between Thomas and Brittany where they discussed his marriage in crude and dismissive terms. Then, when I was absolutely certain that I had everything I needed, I made my move. I scheduled a meeting with Thomas. I told him I needed to talk about something important. I told him to come home from work early. I told him we needed to have a serious conversation. When he arrived home, I was sitting on the couch with a folder in my lap. Emma was in her bassinet in the corner of the room, sleeping peacefully. We need to talk about our marriage, I said calmly. What's wrong? Thomas asked, sitting down across from me. What's wrong is that you've been having an affair, I said. What's wrong is that you've been spending marital funds on your mistress while I've been struggling with postpartum depression and trying to care for our child alone. His face went pale. What are you talking about? I opened the folder and spread out the photographs. The hotel receipts. The private investigator's report. The credit card statements. The photographs of him and Brittany. I'm talking about Brittany, I said. I'm talking about the Riverside Inn. I'm talking about 6 months of betrayal while our daughter was being born and I was at my most vulnerable. Thomas stood up. First came anger. This is none of your business. You're spying on me. You're invading my privacy. Then came manipulation. I made a mistake. I was scared about becoming a father. Brittany doesn't mean anything to me. Please, let's work through this. Finally came begging. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please don't do this. Don't take Emma away from me. I'm her father. I love her. Please. You have an interesting way of showing love, I said quietly. You abandon your wife and your newborn daughter to party with your friends. You have an affair with a woman half your age. You spend money that was supposed to support our family on hotel rooms and bar tabs. That's not love, Thomas. That's selfishness. What are you going to do? He asked. I'm going to divorce you, I said. I'm filing papers tomorrow. I have a lawyer. I have documentation of your infidelity and your abandonment. I'm pursuing full custody of Emma. And I'm going to make sure that you understand what you've done to me and to our daughter. You can't take Emma away from me, he said. Watch me, I replied. The divorce proceedings were swift and devastating for Thomas. David presented all of my evidence to the court. The infidelity, the abandonment, the financial irresponsibility, the private investigator's photographs, the recorded conversations where Thomas spoke disparagingly about me to his mistress. The judge reviewed everything with visible disapproval. Thomas tried to claim that I was being vindictive and that he was a devoted father. But he couldn't explain the 6 months of abandonment. He couldn't explain the affair. He couldn't explain why he'd been spending thousands of dollars on his mistress while his wife was home alone with a newborn. The judge awarded me primary custody of Emma. Thomas received supervised visitation 2 weekends a month, only after I certified that he'd completed a parenting course and engaged in individual therapy. The judge also ordered Thomas to pay child support and spousal support. Given the evidence of his infidelity and his spending on his affair partner, the judge was not sympathetic to claims of financial hardship. But the legal victory was just the beginning. I returned to work when Emma was 2 months old. I worked out a flexible schedule with my hospital that allowed me to be present for my daughter while maintaining my career. My colleagues were supportive and understanding. They were also appalled when they learned what Thomas had done. The hospital is a small community. Word spread. Thomas's reputation, which had been built on his successful financial practice and his carefully curated image as a devoted family man, was destroyed. Clients of his who learned about his infidelity and abandonment of his family began to question his trustworthiness in other areas. Several major clients left his firm. Thomas tried to salvage his reputation by claiming he was a devoted father and that I was being unreasonable with custody. But the supervised visitation made it clear that he hadn't changed. He would show up late. He would leave early. He would try to use the visits as opportunities to ask Emma about me rather than spending quality time with her. Eventually, he stopped showing up altogether. Brittany, realizing that Thomas was no longer wealthy and that his reputation was destroyed, ended their relationship. She told mutual acquaintances that Thomas had pressured her to keep the affair secret, that he'd promised to leave me for her, and that he'd lied about his financial situation. Thomas's practice began to struggle. Clients left. His partners questioned his judgment. He was eventually forced to sell his stake in the firm at a significant loss. He tried to reduce his child support payments by claiming financial hardship. But David presented evidence of his continued spending on bars and clubs and expensive dinners. The judge denied his request and instead increased his child support payments to account for the money he was clearly still able to spend on frivolous expenses. Within a year, Thomas had to sell our house. He downsized to a small apartment. He was forced to live a much more modest lifestyle. All of the status symbols and material possessions that had defined him were gone. Most importantly, he was irrelevant to Emma's life. She grew up knowing her father as a peripheral figure who showed up occasionally and never really knew her. She grew up seeing me as her primary parent, her protector, her role model. As for me, I thrived. I returned to my career with renewed purpose. I took on more challenging cases. I published research on pediatric surgical innovation. I was invited to speak at conferences and teach at medical schools. I became one of the most respected pediatric surgeons in the country. I also became an advocate for women's rights and family law reform. I spoke publicly about my experience with infidelity and abandonment during postpartum depression. I worked with organizations that supported women navigating divorce and custody battles. I used my story to help others understand that they didn't have to accept betrayal and abandonment. Most importantly, I was present for my daughter. I was there for her first words, her first steps, her first day of school. I watched her grow into an intelligent, kind, resilient young woman who understood the value of integrity and commitment. Emma knew the truth about her father. Not in a way that was hurtful or damaging, but in an age-appropriate way. She understood that he'd made poor choices. She understood that sometimes people aren't who we think they are. And she understood that she was worthy of love and commitment from the people in her life. 3 years after the divorce was finalized, Thomas reached out to me. He was married to someone new, a woman he'd met at a support group for people struggling with addiction. Apparently, Thomas had been struggling with alcohol abuse for years. He'd finally gotten sober. He was seeing a therapist. He was trying to become a better person. He asked to have a deeper relationship with Emma. He wanted to be more involved in her life. He wanted to apologize for his abandonment. I consulted with Emma, who was by then 7 years old and old enough to understand the situation. She was cautiously willing to give her father a chance. So I agreed to allow him to spend more time with her, but with clear boundaries and with my involvement. Thomas did eventually become a better father. He showed up consistently. He was present and engaged. He didn't try to undermine my authority or use Emma as a way to manipulate me. He was simply a parent who was trying to do right by his daughter. But I never forgot what he'd done to me. I never forgot the abandonment during my most vulnerable time. I never forgot the betrayal of his infidelity. And I made sure that Emma knew the truth, not as a way to hurt her relationship with her father, but as a way to teach her about accountability and consequences. Here's what I learned through this experience. Betrayal during vulnerability is a particular kind of cruelty. When you're at your lowest point, when you're bleeding and exhausted and struggling with depression, and the person who's supposed to support you abandons you instead, it wounds you in ways that take years to heal. But I also learned that documentation is power. That calmness in the face of chaos is strength. That pursuing accountability through proper legal channels is more effective than seeking revenge. And that living well, thriving in your career, and being a devoted parent to your child is the best possible response to betrayal. Thomas didn't deserve my anger or my desire for revenge. He deserved my indifference. And that's what he got. I moved on. I built a beautiful life for myself and my daughter. I became successful and respected and fulfilled. And Thomas became a footnote in my story, a person who briefly entered my life, betrayed me, and then became irrelevant to my success. That was my revenge. That was my last laugh. If you've been betrayed by a partner during a vulnerable time, if you've struggled to balance motherhood and a career while dealing with infidelity and abandonment, I want to hear your story. Drop a comment below and tell me how you reclaimed your power. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice, betrayal, and triumph. ***. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. These stories of mothers who've overcome betrayal and built extraordinary lives are coming your way. You won't want to miss a single one.